Welcome everyone, and including those who are joining us virtually. This for us is one of our important sessions in our Research and Science Policy Forum, and it's an opportunity to really kind of step back and do a little stock taking, which we like to do in this series in a variety of ways each year, but in this particular session we really want to focus on the various ways we're approaching in somewhat challenging times advocating for federal research support. Over the last really several years, there have been many challenges in general to the place of research, the place of science, the place of knowledge production, how it is the federal government should think about its investments in federal research support, and those certainly have been quite palpable in the context of the social and behavioral sciences, of which education research is kind of a constituent part. So we kind of created this little dinner party here, and I invited 4 of my favorite house guests to AERA. Of course, one is a resident, and one is a resident. And what we want to do is both have a conversation about sort of the realities of how our current situation looks. Some of us marched in the March for Science last Saturday in Washington, D.C., and some of us marched around the country for science, for the value of what science means in an open and democratic society, and the importance of the production of knowledge across the spectrum of fields, including in our fields. And this is a just cause, and the importance of the federal investment in fields like ours and other fields across both the social and behavioral sciences, and is the particular topic that we want to address today. And each of my colleagues is going to provide a bit of a map about the challenges, but we don't want to leave the challenges behind, or we do want to leave them behind, because as importantly is the way that we're working together as really a community of fields, and trying to use our creativity and our inventiveness to really reconstruct both how we do business and how we change the kinds of conversations that can allow for both a deeper understanding of the value of both federal investment in our field and how we contribute to the public interest, and indeed the national security and other kinds of buzzwords that sometimes are commonplace and perhaps making us lower in the pecking order. There's lots of good things on the horizon, although sometimes we've, over the past numbers of months, we've been struck with difficult things, including the federal government remaining open. Well, say for a week. For a week. So while we're here, see that we've gotten a deferral so that we can all go back and work on that. So that's good news, and I suppose there's really other kinds of things that we could point to and do want to point to. The bipartisan commission on evidence that was established about a year ago, when we'll be reporting back this fall, is really focusing on the value of work across sciences and how it contributes to policy making, and no small emphasis is really on the kinds of work that is done both in our fields and in other fields that really contribute to sound and sensible public decision making. So we've got a terrific group here, and I, as both your executive director and as somebody who really likes to advocate for us, can take them. I'm host of the dinner, so I can have my conversation happen among those at the dinner table here. But just to introduce everyone briefly, Wendy Naus is executive director of the Consortium of Social Science Associations, and the Consortium of Social Science Associations is a part of our family. Many of the core research fields in the social and behavioral sciences are governing members. I'm pleased that AERA is among them, of COSA. And we're a collective organization, of which we just have a fine leader who, in her advocacy, is so adroit at making the one science so visible, and that's so important to all of our messages. So she's going to do some doom and gloom, but we're going to end with some upbeat, both a current assessment and a kind of an upbeat orientation to where we are. And then my colleague and a member of our family, I guess we're hosting this dinner together, Juliane, right? As our Director of Government Relations, and with really broad participation across all fields, but really has led our advocacy effort in ways that are both really vibrant and vital and very educative about what it is we are doing and why it is we're doing it. So we have a speaker's corner, which, when are you going to the speaker's corner? Sunday, and so if you want to take your messages back to the home district, there's a little bit of, you can come to our speaker's corner at the exhibit and hear a little bit more. We've got webinars and other kinds of educational activities that I think will make very clear why it is we're advocating and how it is you can be a part of that process. And to Juliane's left is Mark Vieth, who's going to do a little bit of a role play. I guess you're going to introduce yourself, but he's been a very central part of our social and behavioral science advocacy as a, there are sometimes consultants who you engage to consult, and sometimes consultants who bring the depth of experience about the issues and the field that just are members of the family. So I particularly wanted Mark to come to our dinner because he's a member of the family, and it's something that that has really enhanced and expanded our capacity. He's got a lot of shrewd ideas and many years on the Hill, so he's going to do a bit of role playing to keep us sober about what it is staff. I mean, this is we're a drug-free workplace, of course, but to even at our dinner party we are, but to keep us sober about this. And I at this dinner, a part of the virtual feast was to invite Ed Liebow, who's executive director of the American Anthropological Association. And those of us who are executive directors are really in the trenches fighting along with our central staff. And, you know, we're juggling a lot, but really at the heart of our interest is really in advancing, enhancing the field and appreciation of it in a variety of public. So it's a kind of an important perspective to bring to the conversation. And I hope that from wherever you sit and whatever conversations you are having, that you'll join us and give us a sense of the issues on your mind, the things that we should be thinking about, and how we continue to do the important work that we do, both at AERA and as a community of field. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague Wendy, who's going to beep on her.
Great. Okay, I think I'm live. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's good to go first for a variety of reasons, but one is because I feel like I'm always tasked with telling the bad news because my job is to advocate, lobby, I'm a registered lobbyist, for the interests of the social and behavioral sciences community to policymakers in the Congress and in the White House on federal policy. In the last several years, I haven't always had the most positive things to say for those of you who've been following policy. But I'm not here to depress everybody. Instead, I actually want to talk about why I am less discouraged than some of my colleagues in Washington about the state of play right now. And I think it's sort of counter to what we're all sort of feeling, given just the new context, the political context. And I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. It's just we're in a destabilizing period right now, regardless. But for a few reasons, I think we are in an okay position. And I think if we as a community continue to do the good work that we're doing and work together as not just a social science community, but a broader science community and an education community, I think we might be able to come out in the next few years intact at the very least, if not better off. So let me tell you why. Obviously, we're all focused, meaning as citizens, focused on what's happening in the White House and the administration right now, because it's such a stark contrast to where we were in the last administration, and it's very jarring. But it's important to keep in mind that that is just one branch of government, and it's not where policy, where laws are written, and we don't live in a monarchy. So there is checks and balances. And so I'll talk more about Congress in a minute, but I think I want to sober everybody up about the administration and what it actually means for science. So I'm not being naive, I'm just trying to be positive. There are challenges, obviously. We've seen them coming out of the administration already. Not directly to social and behavioral science necessarily, not even to science, but to discretionary spending writ large. This is where I think we're seeing a departure from where we were in past years, particularly when it comes to Congress. COSA was created at a time in the Reagan administration where there was a laser focus on cutting social and behavioral science research funding. And so we've been sort of operating over the last 35 years, always playing defense for those, or anticipating when those cuts are going to come down the pike. But where we are now, we have a president who's working at a really high level. He's working on big issues and looking for big pots of money so that he can balance the budget, come in on all of these promises that he made during the campaign. This is not a White House that's, in my opinion, go into the details, go into the minuscule social science research funding budget across the government, even across all the agencies. It's still a pittance compared to other sections and sectors within the government and within the federal budget. That's just not going to happen. And he's not, I don't think, interested, he, the president, and his folks, interested in really identifying social science as waste, fraud, and abuse. He's working on the big issues. Now, that being said, I think one of the reasons why I think we're not in a dire situation as one might think is because we're no longer alone in the fight against budget cuts. So you have sort of you have two sides of the coin when it comes to the federal budget. You have discretionary and you have mandatory. And then within discretionary, you have non-defense and you have defense. Well, right now we have a president who is interested in cutting taxes, as we've seen over the last couple of days, perhaps investing in infrastructure, not touching entitlement programs. And so what does that leave? Oh, and increasing defense as well on top of all of that. So what does that leave? That leaves a really small chunk of the budget, actually only about 16% of the entire federal budget, non-defense discretionary spending that can be the bank for everything that he wants to do. And non-defense discretionary spending includes research. That's where all the agencies we care about, Department of Ed, NIH, NSF, that's where they all live and get their money. But same with local law enforcement and housing programs, and everything that's non-defense and non-mandatory comes from that 16%. And so we're, on the one hand, it's a scary situation because everyone's on the chopping block. On the other hand, it's nice to have company for once when it comes to defending funding. It's interesting over the last couple of years when we've seen attacks from the Congress in particular on social and behavioral science. It actually has been larger than that. We've seen attacks on peer review in general and merit review and the value of it in the opinion of a handful of members of Congress. It's not a widespread problem. But when that started to happen, we had other sciences, the physical sciences, et cetera, coming to COSA and the social sciences asking for our advice. You've been fighting these battles for so long. Help us battle against these types of proposed cuts. And so we're not alone anymore, and I think that's actually to our favor. We're not going to be singled out, in my mind, in terms of funding, the social sciences writ large. And we have compatriots out there who I think, if we all stick together, I think it'll be really possible to come out on the other side. But let me say a word about Congress, because that's just the White House. The president puts out a budget, which he hasn't really yet, supposed to, but any day now, we'll see. But the Congress really holds the power of the purse. And that's a good thing, because the scientific community has really invested a lot, and the social science community, with my colleagues up here, have worked really hard over the last several years to make sure that social and behavioral science still maintains its rightful place in the federal budget and within the budgets of the federal agencies that fund research. And so you have a budget coming from the White House that would cut NIH by $6 billion, I think was the proposal, at a time when the Congress is trying to increase the NIH budget by $2 billion. So a lot of these things that are coming from the White House are going to be non-starters with the Congress. But again, we're so focused on the White House because it's so different, it's so new, it's scary. But you got to look at the other side of it and what is actually feasible and what folks on the Hill are going to be able to digest. We have big science champions on the Hill, and they continue. And you cannot expect that, even though we now have a Republican Congress and a Republican White House, that the Congress is automatically going to rubber stamp the proposals that the White House lays out, and vice versa. The margins between the parties are actually more narrow as a result of the election, and so bipartisanship is essential. It's not just, wouldn't it be nice if the Democrats and the Republicans would vote together. If you're going to do anything, health care in particular, we watched that play out over the last couple of weeks, controlling the Republicans controlling everything, and they still can't get health care through. You're going to need the Democrats and you're going to need bipartisanship. So I can talk a lot more about the challenges, but what I'm really hoping to do, and what I've been advising folks back in Washington to do, is to just sort of hold your powder. I think we see these negative things coming out of the administration, or we're so quick to react to all of these proposals, whether it's the immigration ban or the hiring freeze for federal workers. And don't get me wrong, there are instances which we need to engage, and we are engaging on these topics. But it's a slippery slope too, and I think there's going to be a lot of stuff. If we were to comment on everything that came out, at some point we as a community could lose our credibility. And so we're trying to be more strategic, and I see my job over at least the next several months is to keep our community calm. Right now, we're not in the crosshairs, the social sciences, and so and we don't want to be, and we don't want to mistakenly put a target on our own backs by being too sort of out front when it comes to some of the things that are coming out of the White House. So I'll start, I think, with that and put that on the table and let my colleagues pile on. And then we'll talk about some solutions, which I think is the goal.
And some of the things that are both going on that may offer solutions, and we'll circle back to Juliane.
Is that on?
Slide it.
So as Felice said, I'm Juliane Barron. I'm the Director of Government Relations at AERA. And I will, as a relentless optimist, I'll echo some of Wendy's hopefulness that it's not quite as dire as it seems. In addition to not being targeted in the skinny budget, we haven't been targeted in the Republican Study Group budget, and we haven't been targeted in Heritage, and those are some of the sources that Congress looks to sort of echo that message. You know, education research, we're very much in the family of social and behavioral science, as Felice said, but I thought, you know, I was sort of asked to drill down a little bit about education research, and particularly sort of how bad is that? I mean, it's not good, but it's not, there are some opportunities in addition to the challenges. One of the things, you know, we share some of the we share some of the battles because we're side by side talking about social and behavioral science broadly. But one thing that's been interesting to me spending the last couple of years talking about education research on the Hill is that congressional staff don't always see education researchers as social behavioral scientists. And that's sometimes I try to think about how that can be an opportunity. I try to think about how, if there's something that they can see about education research that's helpful to them in their district, how can that be an opportunity to sort of broaden their understanding of the social and behavioral sciences. I think there's, we do a lot of visits together actually with the Coalition for National Science Funding, and it's just always interesting to me how the perception of those visits are different based on sort of if we're with the broader community. And then we also, and the Coalition for National Science Funding is the broad scientific community, and then we also do visits with the social and behavioral science community, and then with education. And I think we always do a lot of research of who our audience is and know sort of what their issues are and work together in that way. A couple things though I would say about education research when I'm sort of more solely on that topic is everybody knows a teacher. And I know that that means that they're about to say, and so I know all this about education. And I think some of the similar challenges to social and behavioral science, where people think it's maybe common sense or it's something intuitive, they don't sort of understand the science. That's something that's very similar within education research. I do always brace myself when they talk about their relationship to a teacher as them suddenly having some expertise in education research. Another thing I come across a lot is sort of the myth that there's all this money and to use in education, and to use a quota, and public education is a disaster, and so I think that's really something that we have to fight against a little bit, but we have a lot of good information, and that's sort of another way that education research sort of has an opportunity to be helpful to these offices. And another thing that sort of distinguishes education research at the Institute of Education Science versus education research that's at the National Science Foundation is it's really, and that's sort of, that's a really unique position, because you have NIH and you have NSF, and they're sort of recognized as being research-based. But then you have the Department of Education. And I think one of my first weeks on the job, I went into Senator Cochran's office, and the legislative aide said, I just discovered the Institute of Education Sciences. It's like this little NIH inside the dysfunctional and partisan Department of Education. And I thought, well, I didn't realize you thought of the Department of Education that way, but that's actually kind of helpful to me. I thought if you think of IES in that way, and you think of NIH in that way, and NSF in that way, that's encouraging, and so those are some of the opportunities I look for in terms of focusing on the science. I lost my train of thought there, but so I guess I'll just sort of stop there, because I was just sort of asked to say, how bad is it for education research? And I think that there are certainly big challenges for I think for everybody, not just for science, in a lot of the uncertainty. But I do think that a big opportunity, I found it, is ESSA. I think when we look to the bipartisan support for the Every Student Succeeds Act of last session, and not only were there definitions of tiered evidence for education research, which has just generated a tremendous amount of discussion and recognition that it's it's sort of a common conversation now that's important. But there's also, I'm trying to look at the shifting to the state level decision making as an opportunity, because we do have a lot of researchers really engaged at the state level, and there's lots of great stories to come out of that. And it's a little bit easier to explain than when talking about the federal level. And so I think those are some opportunities as we look forward about our messages and messengers and the way to advocate. I mean, I think those are some opportunities for us to have some effective messages.
Great. Thanks, Juliane. I'm Mark Vieth. I'm Senior Vice President at CRD Associates. And I'm going to give you my perspective as someone who worked for 14 years for a member of Congress from the House of Representatives, and then also 14 and a half years in my current capacity as a consultant. And I spent a lot of time with these distinguished individuals having meetings on the Hill with members of Congress and their staff across the political spectrum, from the far right to the far left. And what I'd like to do is sort of change my voice now to pretend that I'm a staffer. And first I'm going to be on the staff of someone who is critical or an opponent of social and behavioral science, and give you the reason why there's opposition. And then I'm going to talk more from a supportive staffer's point of view. So as an opponent, here's what I'm going to say to you. Thanks for coming into my office. We all love social and behavioral science. It's a great discipline of science. All disciplines of science are wonderful. And in fact, the chairman of the House Science Committee is on record calling for an increase in the National Science Foundation's research budget. But here's the problem. We have a $19 trillion debt. In 2017, we will be spending $352 billion more than we take in. So something has to change. And even good things are going to have to be sacrificed. So what we have to do with the portfolio of scientific research at the NSF is prioritize. We need to take a look at what is truly in the national interest and what isn't. And in my opinion, it's the hard sciences. It's physics, chemistry, biological sciences, computer science. These are the scientific disciplines that make us competitive with China and India. The soft sciences, they're wonderful, but not so much on the competitive basis. So we need to shift money from that very small budget at the Social and Behavioral Economics Directorate over to the other directorates. I should also mention that we have a problem at NSF because we are funding grants such as studying, sorry, I'm going to pick on you, 17th century lawsuits in Peru, the anthropology of those lawsuits. We shouldn't be spending our dollars on that. What is the application of that to current society? Now, the social and behavioral science that is good, and this is kind of a new wrinkle we're hearing, is when you integrate it with other scientific disciplines in areas such as cybersecurity and the opioid epidemic. So that's social and behavioral science. Yeah, we should keep funding that, but we've got a real problem with funding this pure anthropology or sociology, or the other one is political science. Why are we funding political science when you can turn on C-SPAN and CNN and get all the politics you want? So that's kind of what we hear sometimes from the other side. And I think it's just really important for you to get that perspective. We can address a lot of those points.
And this is not a caricature, meaning this is what you hear.
So this is, yeah, it's kind of interesting that we meet with political science grads, and sometimes we hear this message. There's members of Congress who are political science grads that will make these arguments as well. And I should also mention this is a very, as Wendy mentioned, it's really a very small group of members of Congress. But while they're small, they can be disruptive, and they could have an impact in the long term. So let me tell you the point of view from a supportive staffer of what they're looking for from our community. Thanks for coming in. Of course, we support social and behavioral science. We believe that all sciences should be funded across all directorates. But we need to make the case back to our constituents back home that this research has value. So to the best extent that you can provide us real-world examples of how this affects people's real-world problems, that's incredibly helpful. And we also need to hear from our home state universities. And it would be awfully nice if we heard from companies that hire employees in our district about how they use federally funded social and behavioral science to advance their commercial interests. So those are just some things that we hear from the supportive community. And I will echo what Wendy said. I think we're in this period now where there seem to be bigger fish to fry. I think scientific research in general is under scrutiny. And now we're all, we were all in our individual lifeboats, and now we're all getting back on the Titanic and sinking together. So, but at the same time, I think there are enough members of Congress on both sides of the aisle that really support the value of federally funded scientific research across all disciplines. And I think if we continue to do the job that we're doing, we'll continue to defend these disciplines. Ed?
Well, thanks. I'm Ed Liebow. I'm the Executive Director of the American Anthropological Association, and I appreciate the chance to share the living room here with my colleagues. We're based in Washington, D.C. as well. The American Anthropological Association, we also refer to ourselves as the AAA, but not those people who will come and jumpstart your battery or replace your windshield. AAA is smaller than AERA. We have about 10,000 members. We do have a significant number of our members who are interested in the application of ethnographic research methods in educational settings. We have a whole section that is the Council on Anthropology in Education, and a journal, Anthropology in Education Quarterly. And so there is a good deal of overlap with AERA in that regard. I dare say that our association has a long and visible history of speaking out on a number of issues, both at the national and international political levels, and that is just part and parcel of the intellectual traditions of our people. Our researchers tend to identify quite strongly with the underdog, with communities that are often in structurally disadvantaged situations, and often use social science researchers who collaborate with them as a voice to speak truth to power, as we say. And so this is a long-standing pattern within our association to be out there on the barricades and speaking quite forthrightly about these issues. And I said this on November 9th, and it's just as true today on April 28th. Even if the national elections had gone differently, even if the Senate had switched the majority party in these national elections, there was still going to be work to do from the perspective of the social and behavioral science coalitions, from the perspective of the Anthropology Association. And in some ways, it has been a gift to our association the last several months, because we have seen an enormous spike in member engagement. It's really heartening in some ways. People look to their professional and scholarly associations asking us, so what are we going to do about this change in circumstance? And so I, as the executive director, of course, have to be mindful of attending to our members' interests and outright pleas for us to do something. At the same time, we have resources to manage, and we have the regular business of the association to undertake as well. When you ask yourself, what does AERA do for you? What does the American Anthropological Association do for its members? We, of course, put on the research conferences. We publish the flagship journals in our respective fields. We support professional development in a number of ways. And we are the public face of the field to help the public increase its understanding of the importance of the work that our members do. And that has got a number of different dimensions to it. Some of it is so that students who are thinking of enrolling in the classes that you or your professors or colleagues teach have something they can tell their moms about why it's okay to study this stuff instead of going into some other major, some other career path that sounds a little more job ready. So it's important for pipeline issues of making sure that we're refreshing our field and our membership. But it's also important in talking to policymakers. It's important to talking to prospective employers about the value of the training that you receive, so that when you come to them and say, look, I'm a resourceful, creative problem solver with some specific skills that are going to help your organization succeed, they are nodding their heads in the right direction. So those are all things that we as an association do. And so we have to balance that along with our public affairs activities. We have a two-person staff in our association who do work that's very similar to the kind of work that Juliane does, but they also do other things as well. We do not have a full-time government affairs person, which is one of the main reasons why we're so actively involved with the Consortium of Social Science Associations and the Coalition for National Science Funding, and because we like to say in anthropology that we're the most scientific of the humanities and the most humanistic of the social sciences, we are also active in the National Humanities Alliance, which is a close cousin to the COSA group. In this arena of advocacy, we really feel like we've got two sources of power. One is the convening power, the ability to bring people together through our meetings through our publications to exchange ideas. And the other is the power of voice. That is, we can say things together in a collective voice that amplifies what any one single researcher, one institution might say. So what I've asked our membership to do is to think about the use of both of those sources of power, the power, convening power and voice, in three very distinct ways. One is what kinds of ideas about practices that sound promising, advocacy efforts and scripts that we can rehearse, that we can bring back to our institutions and to our local communities and our local organizations and work from there, because as Mark says, the most compelling stories that you can tell to a congressional staffer and to many executive agency representatives are the ones that affect their district, their constituency. So it's really important to tell that story in an impactful way on a local level. There are things that we can do as an association, and you can go to our website, you can go to any of the COSA members' websites, and you'll see a lengthy list of public position statements that have been generated over the years and with greater frequency over the last few months. We have credentials in several United Nations organizations so that we are able to serve in a consultative status to a number of the United Nations organizations on an international scale. We regularly consult with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, similarly on issues that affect communities where our members work outside of North America. And so at an association level, there are a number of ways that we mobilize our resources. And then there is the work that we do in coalitions. And in that regard, it has been our experience over the last few years that anthropology is this big, sprawling intellectual landscape, and no matter what the issue is, you can probably find an anthropologist who studies it. Whether it's air traffic controllers and the language that they use and how that might be misinterpreted by a Malaysian airline pilot, or the people who anthropomorphize animals or dance and trance in Bali. There are anthropologists who study that sort of thing. However, we've had to make some limiting choices about the policy domains that we make priorities, and they're the same policy domains that COSA puts at the top of its list, and the overarching ones that are important have to do with public support for funding. The National Science Foundation is the single largest public source of support for anthropologists, archaeologists, linguists, and biological, physical anthropologists, and also the protection of funding for the federal statistical agencies whose data sets are enormously important to all of us. So power of voice, convening power, things that we do at home, things we do as an association, things that we do in alliance with our sister societies. That's that part of what we do in the advocacy world.
Okay, well, we were going to talk about some of the instrumental approaches we've been using, of which Ed has opened up that conversation. But before I kind of turn back to my colleagues, let me kind of ask whether anyone has not necessarily a question to raise, but a perspective to bring, including from the vantages of your own experiences at your own institutions or your own regions, or kind of looking at the national picture perhaps from your own professional lives. Okay. Well, we'll give you another crack at the apple. While I generally share the view that we should, of course, not jump any guns and be kind of take a good look at the realities of where we are, which definitely had a history before the change of election. There is no doubt that we were facing challenges from thinking we could change the conversation in new and innovative ways 3 years ago to having issues and complexities with the tightness of budget and I'll say euphemistic language like national security that tended to have embedded in a kind of a rank-ordered priority that, as you role-played so effectively, really effectively,
I scared myself.
right, Mark, puts us as, well, it's not that you don't have value, but for investment dollars, you don't have value. So when we think about the fact that there is a National Academy of Sciences panel now on a fast track to be able to speak to the importance of, or the ways in which support for the social and behavioral sciences contributes significantly to the larger society in which we live. And this new panel, I think by June, is that right, is
Yep.
going to be issuing a report. We do know that's kind of in the shadow of the current climb. So how would each of you, if you were panelists on that panel, what would you think we should be doing in order to get some new voices, information, or approaches in what we now would be contributing to trying to alter the way in which both members of Congress, policy leaders, and the executive branch would see fields like ours?
So I'll go first. Am I on? Yeah.
Good.
So I would say, well, first of all, let me say that I think the outcome, whatever comes out of the National Academies in June, I think will be quite positive, even though if you're looking at it from the outside, you might think, this is like a witch hunt or something, but actually I think there is enough to say about the value of the National Science Foundation and its investment in social, behavioral, and economic sciences that it's just we need to say it better. It needs to be better understood. And I think that's what's going to come out, at least in part, of this activity. And I think that points to the larger problem. I've been saying over the last few years, again, before November, the landscape was different, but we were focused more on our critics in the Congress. And our challenges with them, I argue, is a branding problem. Social and behavioral sciences have a branding problem. It's what Juliane alluded to as sort of the common sense problem. Oh, my grandmother told me that. It's an old wives' tale. Why do we need to study that? We don't need evidence behind that. All of these types of things. And what I'm learning more and more now post-election is that we really need, we as individuals, me personally, I think, trying to hear both sides of every issue and step into other people's shoes. We live in a DC bubble. And if I had put money on the election, I would have lost, as would everyone else in Washington. And we're the ones who are supposed to know better, and we don't. So we're in a bubble. Scientists are in a bubble as well. And so we, as advocates, have been forced, I think positively, to rethink how we talk about science and our approaches. So I just wanted to mention, so at COSA we've started working on sort of a three-pronged approach over the last year and a half, which has been working quite well to guide us, I think. The three prongs are direct advocacy and lobbying. We are a staff of 4, but we're all registered lobbyists. And we are the daily boots on the ground in Washington when something happens. There's a bill on the floor and a member of Congress needs talking points, like right now. We're the ones there who could respond quickly. I call that the short game. The long game are the other 2 prongs. One is member engagement, and that is you all. And I think you probably are always being begged by your professional association to be more involved in advocacy, respond to alerts, write to your member of Congress, come to Washington for an annual fly-in and have meetings. Thankfully, I think the environment has forced a lot more of that. Now you guys are coming to us and asking how you can help, and that's fantastic. And it gets to the earlier point about local. Local is so important when you're talking to policymakers. And I can talk more about that, but what I really want to focus on or put emphasis on is the third prong, which is public engagement. Not only do we have a branding problem with policymakers, we have a branding problem with everyone else. Going to Thanksgiving dinner and trying to explain to your uncle what you do and why it's important and why are my tax dollars going to this. And so we've been investing a lot of effort in that. We have a new blog series we call Why Social Science, and it's at whysocialscience.com, where we're trying to bring in different voices, talking about the value of social science to a variety of areas. And not only folks from within our disciplines, but we had the president of the National Academy of Sciences, who's a geoscientist, write a blog on the value of social and behavioral science. We're thinking about ways to be different and innovative when it comes to reaching the public. Encouraging researchers to, you should be going to your city council meetings, not to present, but to hear what your neighbors are talking about. What are their concerns? Going to Rotary clubs, Girl Scout troops, anything you can do to, I think, help make this not be such a linear process of, I need federal dollars, I'm going to go to my member of Congress and they're going to make it right. Those days are over now. The sort of automatic support that you would get, which I think has guided the academic community since the beginning of time, where scientists trust us, it's all good, just keep funneling the money. Not only is that over, it's never coming back. We're now in this era where you have to justify things. This is not sort of a temporary requirement. You need to justify, and you need to make it applicable. We're in an age of social media. People are watching now and people are paying attention. And so the onus is on us to become better storytellers and to do a better job of justifying the important things that we do and the applications of what we do, potentially.
So I agree with so much of that. One thing I'll mention is that, well, not in the Congress in DC, I worked in the Texas legislature here for 3 years actually, and that informs a lot of the way I approach things. Not only was I sort of on the other side of the desk, sort of hearing these requests and sort of having these meetings, but it was a very unbubble-like environment for me. And so, I had to really sort of think about who am I talking to and what's their perception and what problems are they trying to solve and where can we find common ground to start that conversation. So I'd echo, and we do a lot of similar, we have a lot of similar approaches as Wendy was talking about, but I guess I would sort of add to it in terms of building relationships. I mean, there is research that shows people are more comfortable with research from people they know. Like this trusted entity or this trusted communicator. And so we need to think about that, so it's building the relationships and showing up even when we're not asking for something and offering to be a resource, perhaps even insisting to be a resource. And those kind of relationships pay off because then they'll ask you the questions a little bit earlier and then you'll have a little bit, you can be helpful and you can have that discussion. So I think that would sort of be just sort of to Wendy's point, and having sat on the other side of the table, it's a reasonable question. Is this a good use of taxpayers' dollars? And so we have to have good answers to that question. But if we want them to ask us, I think they have to have heard from us before, and not just when we're angry about something. They have to have seen our value. And I think about it a lot in terms of messages and messengers. And so sometimes, actually, I'm not the best messenger, depending on what the office is. And so I think about working with my colleagues, whether it's practitioners groups or university, and I know that they're a really good messenger in a particular office, and then I find that common ground and we can all work together. And so, a little sort of thinking about that, which I think is very much in line, I think is what I would add.
Which is, I should say, fundamental to why we do the Hill visits and why we encourage home visits in the district, but so that the voice of research is really part of that visit. It isn't as much an ask. I mean, there's not that much we're asking for at this point. There's certainly no growth ask, but it really is to make real the value of what we do. Mark?
Let me address specifically the National Academies study. And I don't know exactly what is going to come out of that study. I assume that it's going to be good and that it's going to show some real-world examples of how social and behavioral science help protect our country and our homeland. I hope that's true. If it is, I think it's really important for those in the military to deliver that message to Congress, to say that there is a value to national security. I think that would be tremendously helpful for us. And as long as I've been engaged in this, this type of advocacy, I've always had a fantasy of going up to the Hill with a couple generals with me. I mean, nothing would resonate better than having a couple generals with, you know, all their ribbons and, you know, saying, Congressman, we need this research to fight ISIS, to defend our homeland, to advance national security. So I'd love to get somewhere close to that someday with our advocacy. Let me talk too about the challenges that we have for our sales job with Congress. I think people always forget that at least the National Science Foundation, their portfolio of science is primarily basic research. So we don't know from the outset what the application of that research is going to be to our society. And I find it very interesting that at the National Institutes of Health, which I love, in another element of my job, I advocate for that research as well. But I find it very interesting that no one in Congress goes through the grants at NIH, you know, that talk about some very arcane cell biology and molecular structures and how diseases interact in that fashion. Stuff that I don't even understand, they don't understand, but they kind of take it for granted that this is going to help at some point, that this is going to eventually help us find cures and new treatments for chronic diseases. They don't think that way about NSF, and I often wonder why. And maybe it's just there's just a more tangible benefit that people see if they have a sick kid or they have a family member who all of a sudden they're getting a therapeutic that was the result of a federal investment in research. And I don't think we quite have that sort of concrete, tangible pathway that we can sell to the public. So that's a real challenge for us that I think we need to focus on quite a bit.
I'm glad you bring up NIH and the question about knowledge cycles and pathways from bench science to some
bench to bedside,
relevant sounding intervention of some sort. In another life, I headed a team that actually did some work for the NIH on the public health impacts of their basic research portfolio. And among the things that were really interesting about this was that the fact that you got an NIH grant, where an investigator who got 1, 2, or more grants of basic research in, say, the genetic predisposition that places you at greater risk for asthma when exposed to certain environmental triggers. The fact that you were an NIH-supported investigator got you a date to testify at a state legislative hearing where you could testify on behalf of school nurses being licensed to have rescue medicine in their cabinet in school. It had nothing to do with your epigenetic research at all, but the reputation that you gained gave you an enormous voice of authority to be able to talk to state legislatures and change those rules of nursing licensure. And so that pathway from this basic research to translating this into meaningful policy is complicated. And I know people, legislative staffers and the members themselves, don't want to hear it's complicated.
Yeah.
But it is, and we don't need to apologize for the fact that that knowledge cycle is complex, and that just like any business, the National Science Foundation has to have a risk portfolio. There have to be some things that are surer, more on target, and other things that are really innovative and way out there, and we don't really know exactly what the payoff is going to be.
If I could just add a quick comment on both what Ed and Mark said. To reiterate, we need to be able to explain what we do and why in a few sentences. We just have to. It doesn't have to be relevant to an immediate something, curing some disease or whatnot. Mark alluded to a very important problem that we're having with the Congress relative to this branding issue. Congress thinks short term. They do not think 10 years out, let alone 50 years out, when we might reap the benefits of an investment in basic research. They're trying to reconcile for themselves, what is the purpose of investing in scientific research? Is it to increase the body of knowledge, or is it to produce evidence? Well, it's both. But it's this focus on producing evidence that is most satisfying and appealing to a policymaker, because their work is linear. They enact some policy, they put money in it, and then there's going to be a return on that. That is counter to what the scientific community is or should be. And so there's a risk of falling into a trap of we need to conform to what policymakers want. You know, we try to an extent to apply our value to things like national security or health or the economy. And that works for some research projects, and it doesn't, nor should it, for others. But that's risky too, because what is really at risk when it comes to policymakers and our critics on the Hill, again, like a handful or so of members of Congress who happen to be influential at the moment, they will say to you, I love social science as long as it's applied to engineering or biology or computer science. And so what we're trying to defend is, take NSF for example, that there be a directorate for social, behavioral, and economic science to study the fundamentals of those fields and of those disciplines. That is what is on the chopping block. If our loudest critic in the House had his way, the SBE directorate would go away, and the other directorates would throw a couple tens of thousands of dollars at social science every now and then to apply to tack onto another grant. So our messaging has to be very careful. We have to be storytellers, but not conform necessarily always to the message that is coming from the Hill. We still want to do justice to our work.
You know, in some general way, NSF as an agency was part of a compact post-World War II about the value of investing in fundamental science. And that while we think of there being two major federal science agencies, NIH and NSF, NIH is more mission linked insofar as it is a major set of institutes dedicated to science that advances and promotes health and well-being. And NSF's mission is the health of science, with a much smaller, by every dollar, one could, even in the green salad days, with a really small budget, but the notion being that you need the DNA in each field in order to populate and drive what happens in the more mission agencies, whether it is National Institute of Justice in justice-related work, whether it is IES with respect to education and addressing issues of education and learning. And that partnership seems under some degree of challenge right now, which isn't to say that NSF is vulnerable, but there are particular areas of science within NSF, environmental science being one, and social and behavioral sciences being another, that are, I think, lightning rods for a kind of more subtle conversation about the value of this long-term investment. So I recently had an opportunity to see a very short segment of a video by President John F. Kennedy, I think it was 1963, at Vanderbilt, and Google it, you will see it. And he was speaking to how important it is in our country to invest in science, how investments in science spawn creativity, spawn innovation, and education. And so that those three stools are kind of the fundamental, kind of bedrock. And I think we do have exemplars in this area. In education, I thought, Juliane, you pointed to something that I want to kind of resurface and emphasize. And that is that there can be something of a confabulation. And I think in all social and behavioral sciences, there could be something of a confabulation between the institutions that we study and the social processes we examine and the science of our fields. So, oh my God, education is just a mess. Well, therefore the research must be a mess.
Why haven't you solved that?
Right, haven't you solved that yet? Yeah, well, you know, if we could triple our budget, we could solve that issue. And we talk about, you know, SBE and the relationship and the place of education research in the social and behavioral sciences. It really is more than about directorate. I was at the National Science Foundation when the social sciences were part of behavioral, biological, and social sciences. We did fund fundamental research. I was a champion of moving to a separate directorate, but it wasn't because fundamental science wasn't funded in the social and behavioral sciences, is that we were really ripe enough to be a comparable science. I think we've become more visible as a function of that. But I think for all of us, and I guess I'd like you to sort of address that, how do we effectively speak to both nuggets of knowledge as well as the importance of investing in the fundamentals of our field, including the methods of our field, in order to make these contributions that spawn innovation, spawn education, and allow us to resolve some of the most difficult problems of humankind, whether it's public safety, whether it's our place in the international community, which I think, Ed, you've addressed, and some of your thoughts about that?
Well,
We could reverse the order.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start by telling you a little story about my March for Science last Saturday.
Good.
I was standing out there in the rain, you know, off to the side of the
Soaking.
stage, and this guy came by. He's dressed in a suit, and he had, you know, Member of Congress lapel pin on him. I didn't recognize him, but he shook my hand, and I was wearing a big COSA pin that said I heart social science, and on the outside of my raincoat. And he asked me if I wanted to have my picture taken with the only PhD scientist in the House of Representatives. And I kind of scratched my head and I pointed at the button. I said, "Really? You're a physicist, aren't you?" Bill Foster,
Yes,
is his name,
right.
Illinois 10th. And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, do you consider the social sciences to be science?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what about David Price
Right.
and Dan Lipinski and Derek Kilmer, who are all social scientists with PhDs who serve in the Congress?" And he kind of scratched his head and he said,
for you.
"Well, thank you for that." And so we did have our picture taken. I don't know.
Well, point well taken.
Yes.
I saw a story where he described himself that way. And
Yeah,
I was
and
taken
he's-
aback myself.
Right.
So I'm glad he met you.
So that's a layer away from what do we do about evidence and at the same time the sort of institutional setting in which social science is undertaken. When this is ultimately your audience, and they need to hear this many times too, to be able to I think have it sink in like that. But it's likely to be. I got to hear a presidential address or a session earlier this afternoon that Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot gave, where she among other things said, you know, that we need to change our view and be able to emphasize the good things that we're seeing out there, the promising practices that can be documented, and the reasons why those appear to be promising practices. Her talk had two other V words in them. One was voice and the other was visibility, and I think that they're all applicable in this context immediately. That those nuggets, if we're emphasizing things that work, not what's going wrong, that is an easier story to tell, I think. You know, when we bring the Intel social scientists to talk to the member of Congress whose district includes the People and Practices Research Lab in suburban Portland, Oregon, she wants to go out there and see what those people are doing, because she had no idea there were social scientists working at the Intel Corporation. So, you know, emphasizing that without being Pollyanna-ish about it, I think there are a lot a lot of promising stories.
So my opaque question was actually, I was thinking kind of softball, and when I said, well, maybe start with Ed, I think the work that the American Anthropological Association has been doing in the museum program has just been a way of elevating and understanding among the publics about how it is, knowledge about race, about immigration, is so fundamental to the challenges that we face day in and day out.
So for those of you who aren't aware of it, we have this traveling museum exhibition about race. It's called Race, Are We So Different? That focuses on the science of human biological variability and its cultural constructions, the history of the uses and abuses of that science, and the lived experience of people who've been subject to those policies. We're starting down that same path with something on immigration, another very important topic that, of course, intersects with educational research that is so important and also quite often difficult to talk about in public. And so that's drawing nigh obliquely to the object of changing the public conversation, but we think that that's an important investment to make.
And
Go ahead.
Who, me?
Yeah.
I sort of want to build on that too, because I think a movement within both at AERA but also within the field of education is sort of more engagement. And so I'm with Wendy. I never like to risk implying that it's only applied that's useful, and I always sort of mention the basic and fundamental, but I think you kind of build that relationship and you get in the door by talking about the applied and how you can be helpful. And then from there, and so that's why these sort of more active engagement with researchers and practitioners or researchers and policymakers, then you're going to hear it more. When you say, well, it isn't just that, oh, we came up with this idea and just happened this year. It sometimes comes from decades of learning and decades of knowledge that we didn't know if it would be useful or not. And so those kind of, I think there's a movement both at NSF and IES even asking about dissemination, or they're sort of inspiring this engagement. And so I think that we're on the right track. I mean, I think that, and I think that's sort of a way to sort of help them understand the longer story. The other thing that comes to mind is I remember when he was still in Congress hearing Rush Holt on the radio and talking about, on a program, and he was talking about how the people who vote need to be saying, show me the science. Like, I don't want to just hear your thought or your opinion about something and just sort of demand, like, that sounds good, but like, tell me why, and I thought that was really powerful to me, and I have no idea how we're going to accomplish that. That's a really big task, but it sort of, it made me think of your question, Mark, about sort of like, why do they think that this science is valuable and that's not? And I think, I think they know that they don't understand the way microbiology works, so they know that they don't know that, but there's a lot of things that they think they do know. They don't realize the degree to which they don't understand certain things, or that there's nuance, or there's things that that actually aren't just common sense, and so I think, anyway, I mean, those are things I think about, and I think the public needs to understand that too in order to demand the science, and then, because they care about the voters, I mean, that's sort of something that would get us to them to understand the more complicated picture.
Mm-hmm.
You just made me think, going back to my days as an undergraduate, and I studied the social sciences. I was a political science and international relations major. And my friends who were in computer science, engineering, I always thought they were just a lot smarter than me, because I just didn't understand what they were studying. And maybe what I don't understand is they probably didn't understand what I was studying, and they might have been saying the same thing, like, how does he know this international relations stuff? So, but I think it is almost embedded in our psyche. And the only other thing I will say, the thing that drives me crazy is when I hear the term soft science. Mm-hmm. Because to me, all science is hard. And we really need to get that out of the vocabulary.
Especially from soft scientists. When they
exactly.
One of the things we do know from the social and behavioral sciences is that early exposure to an understanding is very embedded in your perspective in the world. And many of us are quite too casual about the importance of including social and behavioral, including education, science, within the curricula and understanding of what constitutes science education. Resocialization is very difficult. There is really no reason why the study of social and behavioral phenomena cannot be part of the science learning. Indeed, for all kinds of reasons, including the ease in which one learns earlier. We know this from the developmental sciences about things that one can understand that are closer and more tangible and less abstract. It's just Piaget 101. Right. And yet, even we in the social and behavioral science community have to do a cognitive leap to remind ourselves that science learning includes the study of social and behavioral phenomena. And I think that that's a long haul challenge that we really do need to, really take seriously in our fields. One of the things that I actually do think is also a challenge, I find myself having been part of, and Juliane has been a collaborator on, two major initiatives that we've been undertaking over the past couple of years to change this conversation. And one of which is the Knowledge Forum, where we were doing, bringing together policymakers in a retreat location. We were had major strands of core research. They were very short talks to spark and ignite exchange. We've got these fact sheets and the ed talks on the website. And there was really profound science in each of those areas with fact sheets, and we now have collected information about the agencies that funded various pieces of this research. And even there, it's on 4 topics, and it's kind of a challenge to think about how to aggregate that. We had the dean's meeting, how to aggregate that so it sort of scales up in the way that a comet scales up. Right. But each of these areas are really important kinds of, sort of not just nuggets of knowledge in a ephemeral way, but the ways in which over decades, from experimental work to field work, we've learned that learning in diverse environments is not only of value to underrepresented minorities, but it's also of value to majority populations. It's a catalytic stimulus for cognitive thinking in diverse and reversible ways. It's just a clear kind of an illustration of a finding that could be the kind of example that the Academy could cite, but that's not my concern about the report. It's how that's going to scale up to knit a story about the larger story. We found this. We're doing these conversations. Many of you may have picked up on some of these. Well, we've done 6 this year. We're going to do 4 next year, where we'll have a topic like school discipline or poverty in education or early child care. And in those situations, we actually involve policy persons from the community, from the area, to talk about the research. And one of the things I actually do think is important about science and about the social behavioral sciences is, if you see some of these, if you go back and you see some of the videos on our website, the conversation is not always about research, although I'm impressed with how frequently the research is brought in and the data and the statistics and the findings. Sometimes the conversation in the community is on other things that are really bothering people about their daily lives. But then they turn to us and say, are you going to come back? Because you've created the context where knowledge matters, and how we can convey that it's not just about some findings, but it is about, I go back to that 1963 conversation at Vanderbilt, it is about research fields like ours stimulating innovation, stimulating communication. So I'm interested in, and that was part of this question, how we might use, well, we've got to gather them and figure them out, but how we might use these, what we're always asked for, the nuggets of knowledge. When I was at NSF, what are the nuggets of knowledge? To change the conversation so that the more conservative staff member who kind of wonders why it is, I don't mean conservative in the political sense, but conservative in the, gee, we have to use our resources where they're most strategically valuable, how to turn around a sense that this has some value.
I think part of our challenge, and it's not just for the social sciences, but academic research in general, we have to do a better job of listening and inserting ourselves into the conversation as opposed to telling, this is what the science says, so now go do it. You're not going to listen to me? Okay, you're lost. As opposed to, I think the real value, if you haven't watched any of the videos of these Knowledge Forum events, you should, because it's not all about someone dictating what their research says to a room.
You got that, good.
Yes, I did. And instead, it's the researcher coming in and adding to the conversation. This is why I said Girl Scout troops, Rotary clubs, senior centers, the local VFW, something. Because until that happens and we continue down this road of we're just going to do research in our silo and we're going to publish it and we hope that somebody picks it up, and they won't, at least in terms of a policy-making sense, because policymakers do not read journals. Nothing is going to change, and in fact, we're just going to keep entrenching ourselves even more. And other sciences are starting to get this and are doing a better job of embedding themselves within communities and within larger issues and sort of de-siloing themselves. And it's just something that I've observed over time that I think we need to listen.
And I think that is an important part of changing that conversation, because fundamental to those fora are, well, what are you doing where if we had further knowledge, it would help you in what you're doing, and that's very, very important.
Exactly, and just on that point, in our advocacy work, just since the beginning of the year, in the new Congress, we've had, 50 or so meetings on the Hill across the political spectrum and across the country. With folks that either need convincing or shoring up their support. And in these meetings, we had no ask whatsoever. Instead, we are on receive. And our ask, if we had one, would be use us as a resource. Will you use us as a resource? And it's very unsettling to a congressional staffer. One of them actually said at the end of the meeting, so what are you asking me to do? Do you need something? Can I help you with something? And this was actually with a very critical office. They still are on like, I'm here, I'm a public servant, and I'm here to serve you something. Tell me what that is. And I said, we don't have anything. We want you to use us. And they have, just in the last couple of months. I mean, we have offices contacting us and saying, my boss cares about cybersecurity, he needs experts on X, Y, and Z. And they may not always need you and your expertise, but you want them reaching out to you because you're a conduit to something that's so much bigger.
But you do have to go to them.
You do. You have to go to them.
I think that when I started in this job, a lot of researchers, and understandably so, thought, well, I have this terrific, rich, useful research. If they're trying to figure this out, they'll find me. And that's just not how it works. People, you have to deliver it in a digestible form to the Hill. And I think, and I'd be interested to hear what others think, and this came up the other day, but sort of the new think tank establishment is a little bit challenging because they present things in ways that sort of speak to the ideas that members of Congress already have or the solutions that they're already putting forward. And whereas the scientists are much more helpful, I think, often in asking the right questions or sort of a little bit earlier on in the process. And so it's very hard when you ask congressional staff where do you get their information. It's usually from the think tanks or the advocacy agencies that sort of are already supporting, they have the research that already supports what they have already thought. And so that puts us at a disadvantage, and scientists are uncomfortable with that. They don't want to just say, yes, I can support what you already think. They want to come to it in a much more organic, honest, investigative way. And so, I mean, our think tank colleagues are our friends, but they figure that out a little bit in a way, and we shouldn't adjust to that, but it definitely, if we don't do the translating for them and we don't sort of have those relationships, then they're going to turn to the think tanks.
And we're in an era where you can't just you can't assume the research is going to speak for itself. The think tanks exist. They're think tanks. They're telling folks how to think about something. They've digested the research. They've done the research themselves. They've packaged it up and put a little bow on it, and they're delivering it and say, look at Heritage Foundation. And point by point, the president's skinny budget follows the Heritage Foundation's budget blueprint. Because there it is, it's packaged, it's ready to go, it's aligned with their ideologies, and it's science-based enough, whatever that means, to be legitimate and a source that the administration can use. Take the March for Science, for example. There was, in the months leading, it was an amazing event. And the months, and I'm thrilled, because the months leading up to that, there was so much sort of hand-wringing in the scientific community, at least the Washington science advocacy community, about, is this in our best interest? Should we be doing this? We don't want to politicize science any more than it already is. In the end, it was the best thing to do. And I think the folks who didn't march or didn't endorse or who were silent on it or opposed, I don't know if anybody actually opposed it in terms of the societies, they're the ones who I think are going to feel more blowback. But we get it. This is not, outreach is not why you got into research. You want to do your work, you want to do great work, you wanted to change the world in some way or advance the field, and we get that. Unfortunately, that's not enough anymore. Again, I blame social media for pretty much all of the ills of the world, but
You gotta lighten up. You're the younger generation, Wendy.
it makes it so you
Don't
can't,
tweet that.
you can't hide anymore. If you wanted to do your good work and do it in isolation and then publish and just have a traditional career in academia.
I mean, after all, we are the social sciences.
Well,
we should refrain from the social, right?
Yes, that's my point. We're not going back. And so we need to, as an academy, we need to embrace where we're headed.
Yes, please.
So, you know, it really resonated to hear you talking about how, you know, similar to when Reagan came in. And I was certainly around in those years. And I remember how competitive it was for funds and yet how it drew groups together.
Definitely.
And got a lot of people sort of, you know, involved. Also at the grassroots level. What I'm seeing, and I would appreciate hearing someone out there address this to me, is this rather disturbing pattern or trend, at least from where I live, which is this sort of what I call constituent avoidance. It's almost like there are so many people calling these offices with whatever their issues are and so many problems that you're seeing elected officials just canceling meetings, showing up at different times when they said they were going to show up, and being very difficult to even reach out to. Do you have any thoughts or advice about that?
I can jump in on that. You're absolutely right. I mean, you are seeing members of Congress in general avoid these large-scale public meetings. But I am at least still seeing that they're taking one-on-one meetings back in their district. And sort of to echo on what Wendy was saying earlier, this is a good time to listen. I think this is a good time for anyone in this audience or anybody viewing from home to try to schedule an appointment with your elected officials, or at least with their staff. You can do it you don't have to come to Washington, D.C. You can do it in your home state. And generally, those meetings are viewed by politicians as being very civil forms of engagement. So you're not going to have this sort of crowd mentality where people just get angrier and angrier. So there's still, you know, as far as I know, they're still taking those kinds of meetings. And in many ways, that's much more effective engagement and advocacy.
I mean, I agree. The issue here is I'm seeing that also stop.
Okay.
Oh, really?
I'm really a bit troubled by it because you're right. There should be more of a willingness, but it's like people can't even get a phone call, take a phone call.
Right.
Well-
Well, the phone calls are tricky. I mean,
Yeah.
just because they're, I would say a letter or email because they still have to register it. I mean, and they care, and they at their staff meetings, they say, are we hearing about this issue from everybody? And so even if they don't like it, they have registered it. Like they keep a tally. And so don't be discouraged, I guess is one thing I would say. But I would say the phone's probably the worst way to try and communicate because they are ringing off the hooks and, you know, they can not answer that, but they can't not receive your email or your letter. I mean, that's going to get to them, and then at some level they're accountable to that.
I also think that we're definitely in a spike in terms of constituent engagement. People who have never thought to call their member of Congress before are picking up the phone, which is great on the one hand. On the other hand, members of Congress don't know what to do with that. They're used to hearing from the same person on Sycamore Street every Wednesday or something, That's sort of a wholesale hearing from the entire state in every corner and every walk of life. They don't know what to do with that. I think that'll taper off. I think, everyone is still coming off of the election, and I think as the months and the years go by, there will be a new sense of normal. I do hope people will still engage. But chaos and all, policymakers still have to do the work. Their staff still have to do the work, and they still need folks like you, like our organizations in Washington, to help them make sense of the landscape. And they like to do that by working behind the scenes. And so this gets back to building the relationship, not just going and having a meeting once, but making sure that you check in. They're not going to come to you until they know you. I personally can't remember somebody's name until I meet them 3 times. Think of it that way. They get 200 emails a day, a single congressional staffer. They need reminders that you're there as a resource, and they'll go to their trusted people over and over again. There's this interesting data out there. And Juliane alluded to it, but there's the survey that happens every year of congressional staffers, and they ask things like, who do you trust for information when you have a tough policy decision to make? And they list all of these different things. And the first one is always the Congressional Research Service, which is essentially like a research office for the Congress at their beck and call. Second is experts, issue experts in the different fields, whatever it is. Then they ask another question: what do you actually consult when you need to get information? And issue experts are at the bottom of a list of 20 things. And number 2 after the Congressional Research Service is they Google it. Because they're turning things over so quickly. They're just like you and me. We got to find a good Thai restaurant. We're going to Google it. We're not going to go to someone we know who had a great Thai meal. We're just going to figure it out on our own. It's the exact same thing, and it's terrifying. But that's how policy is made. It's very quick and it's very superficial. And so we need to find a way to penetrate that better. And you can do that by longer term relationships and working behind the scenes, taking the camera off of these town halls that are not doing anybody any favors.
I just had another thought too. Requesting a meeting about something maybe slightly different than what you really want to talk about, but something that they want to talk about, like not a total bait and switch, but sort of if you know who, know more about the audience a little bit and sort of find that common ground and, get your meeting. And by the way, because you don't want to, you could put something, I'm upset about this in a letter, but if you're thinking about the relationship and if you want to sort of just get in there to get that dialogue started, and that's sort of back to the listening theme as well, sort of putting some thought into who that person is, who would they listen to or what would they want to hear, and then going from there.
And I have somewhat to my surprise in the work that we've been doing in these discussion fora in various cities, how much key state officials care about the continued federal investment in research. This is not a burden they feel they could pick up, and that the investment in data systems, the investment in research that they can extrapolate from and use in governors or mayors' offices of early education, they rely on that knowledge base in a very startling way. So the extrapolation from that is that we need to be thinking about parts of those communities that we don't necessarily typically touch, in addition to the home office visits, the state representatives. We've had at several of these fora key city offices that are using these data, these findings, and they are part of that public with a bit of additional clout in their in relationship to the home offices too. So I think creating fora where some of the research conversations can unfold with leaderships in the local area can also have some extrapolation effect that I don't think I myself had focused on when we were doing that. We wanted these individuals to come and participate in the conversation, but they are also, people who are going to participate in this larger conversation. So both R's and D's were worrying about, well, what would happen if there were no longer, after years of important investment in the state longitudinal administrative data systems in education, if that gets cut off, how are they going to be able to pick up that burden and use that information in the work that they are doing in their offices in an everyday way? That was a good spark question. Is there another? And hopefully this has resonance. Yes, please.
My name is Daniel. I work with Ed at AAA.
Good.
And I'm one of those education anthropologists.
Oh.
Put him on the spot.
Excellent.
I can ask him later, so this is for the rest of you. I wanted to pick up the thread about member engagement, which I was thinking about because I was at a poster session yesterday talking to a researcher who had been working on performance pay for teachers. And what she was finding was that performance pay for teachers increases retention, decreases morale, and has basically no effect on student achievement. So teachers are staying in their jobs, but they hate it, and it's not making a difference one way or the other. And I said to her, have you brought this to policymakers? And she's like, I guess someday maybe. And I think, if I think about the work that we've done with anthropologists, most anthropologists will tell you that anthropology has relevance to issues of current importance. But that their own research, they don't see the direct connection to it. And I think part of the problem here is that while policy is being made in this very superficial way, to the extent that our membership is made up of academics, academics are trained that you know what you know, and what you don't know, you cite other people. And so I imagine it must be very uncomfortable to be an expert on the epigenetics of asthma and asked to testify before a state legislature about school nurses. Add to that the fact that it doesn't count for tenure.
Right.
And then my time is better spent writing for the audience of 5 people who read the Journal of Underwater Basket Weaving, rather than putting together these white papers like the Heritage Foundation.
Yep.
So given that we now have this increased interest from members in getting involved, how do we help them to see themselves as people who can tell these stories, to become trusted and valued by policymakers? And then working on the theory that if they value us, the money will come.
That's an awesome question.
Yeah, it is.
And great observations. If the crisis of late has done nothing else positive, it has, I think, energized our members and our base, and has been has accomplished what we as associations have been begging for decades. Get involved, feel the fire, be part of it. It's now happening. They've come to the water, and we have to figure out how to get what to feed them to drink. And so it's new ground, I think, for associations too. I think there are so many aspects to that question. The incentive structure is so inconsistent with where the world is in terms of having research impact policy or impact people in general. I think it's going to take several years for our community writ large, science and academia, to get our heads around what is the appropriate role for researchers when it comes to informing this type of work. But it's exactly where the focus needs to be.
Right.
Right
And
now.
there's definitely a shift.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a conversation going on. It's not underground. And pieces, for example, the knowledge forum that we introduced, we did start with quite experienced and accomplished researchers to be able to communicate in effective ways with policymakers with the backbone of their research. But we were doing it not because we were elite about that, but to illustrate that accomplished persons feel that kind of commitment, and their work has been cumulative in such a way that they need to incorporate that in their both learning about the impact of their work and communicating about it. And so we're seeing this in things like the I guess, newly established, I think, the higher education or the doctoral kind of revisiting panel that Alan Leshner is chairing at the Academy. There's lots of conversations going on around this, and I think appropriately so. The next generation of scholars are learning in a different kind of environment where there's much more of a seamlessness between, we hope, the more academic environments and the rest of the world in which we sit. And you can see this in a lot of social spaces. So I don't think it's far off, although I do think part of our responsibility as scientific society leaders is to, push that, because it's very hard to jerry-rig and backfill what we need to know and change relationships. It's much more logical from what we know to cultivate a different way in which we are embedded in the larger society in which we sit and contribute to that. And we've got wonderful exemplars in my colleagues at my left. So am I hearing another comment? No.
I mean,
So we will continue this conversation.
I would just say,
yeah, Mark?
maybe I'll be a little controversial here, but
Okay. Go for it.
for conversations like that, I would push back to a researcher and say, you've taken all this time to invest in understanding something that's going to have a benefit to society. Shouldn't you take the time to share that knowledge with those that can make a difference? I understand it's not going to help you get tenure, but are you only in this game for tenure, or is there something bigger?
And IES is asking that question. I mean, and NSF too, in terms of they're requiring more dissemination, not just. I mean, I think that I agree. I think that the federal agencies with the money
and
are
Dean's
asking
are
that.
talking about that. That was the subject of our last year's conference and this year's pre-meeting. So what I'm saying is the conversation is going on among also those who are the current gatekeepers. It's not just someone swimming against the tide,
right.
But the tide's got to go in and out. And I think there's a kind of a recognition that really one of the basic principles of science is not to whistle in the forest so no one can hear it. Kurt Lewin, there's nothing as relevant as a good theory. And that is one of the elements that has perhaps been underemphasized as across science fields, that cumulative knowledge building, communication are really basic elements of building knowledge. It's part of that feedback loop. And we've got to elevate that stool in the mix of what scientific processes are and how we evaluate it. And there is a wonderful panel that Ed is going to be talking, an open forum tomorrow at 2:45 on science communication, that is using the backbone of 2 Academy reports to kind of spark, I think, that very conversation, of which one of those Academy panels was chaired by a prior president of AERA, Catherine Snow. And so I should say that is an indicator of the significance. Not only was it an Academy report, but how significant leading scholars in our field take time for that kind of service to address an important issue. And I want to thank my colleagues for taking time from being in the DC trenches to join with us at the AERA annual meeting. Of course, Juliane, you had no choice because we're all here together, right? We go from annual meeting to annual meeting, but we're pleased that you've participated in the way that you've had, and Wendy and Mark and Ed. This is a conversation important to us all, and all of you who stuck with us. Those who are with us virtually, we now have an.
They're waiting for dessert.
Right, exactly. We now have an evergreen. Now we have an evergreen product that will be carrying forward, and we hope this is a conversation that in all of these sessions we keep alive, because it's a very important one, and we welcome the feedback. Thank you all.
Thank you.